Hello, fellow communicators, and welcome to Stories Lived, Stories Told, a podcast celebrating and teaching storytelling and communication using the theory Coordinated Management of Meaning, or CMM for short. CMM is a communication theory that was developed in the 1970s by Barnett Pearce and Vernon Cronin. Since then, it has been evolving to remain relevant in today's conversation surrounding communication. The theory addresses the complex nature of our communication, giving us new language to talk about what we experience and new tools to help us reflect on our communication. Today, the principles of CMM are kept alive and well by the CMM Institute for Personal and Social Evolution. Today, we're going to learn a little bit about one of the CMM Institute's initiatives, CosmoKidz. Because the guests on our next week's conversation episode are three amazing teachers of CosmoKidz, this will help set some context for that conversation. Let's get started. CosmoKidz is a set of activities developed by the CMM Institute, designed to be used by anyone who interacts with kids. Parents, teachers, grandparents, mentors, whoever. And according to the CMM Institute, the goal of CosmoKidz is to give children skills and abilities that help them develop care for self, others, relationships, and the environment so that they can thrive in the 21st century. Going all the way back to the beginning then, CosmoKidz was developed in a very CMM-ish way, returning to the central claim of CMM, which is that persons in conversation co-construct their own social realities and are simultaneously shaped by the worlds they create. Kim and Merritt, the creators of CosmoKidz, really leaned into the idea of co-constructing. Honestly, that's something I usually overlook in this claim. For me, it's easier to talk about the idea of what it means to be a person in conversation or to talk about social worlds. But this idea of co-construction that is nestled right in the middle of this claim, which refers to the fact that our communication just does not happen without other people, that we're never truly constructing something by ourselves, or that we're always coordinating with others. This is vital to the CMM theory, and it's vital for having a realistic understanding of what our communication looks like day to day. So what Merritt and Kim were able to do was to co-construct the CosmoKidz activities with children. The audience of CosmoKidz is clearly kids, so it was important that they be a part of the conversation in order to stay aligned with the real values of CMM. Rather than pushing onto the kids what the adults thought they needed to know, by bringing kids into the conversation, Kim and Merritt were able to see what already existed in kids' minds and hearts, what they already thought or knew about their social worlds and their relationships, and to build better activities from there. According to the CMM Institute website, part of the larger context that CosmoKidz exists in is a shift in educational practices from, quote, training students for cleverness, competition, and success, to helping them become fulfilled individuals, whatever their talents, and active, compassionate citizens. Now, you may have heard the term soft skills before, soft skills being skills that enable an individual to relate to or to interact with others more effectively. Soft skills are things like critical thinking or problem solving. And as someone who graduated with a degree in interpersonal communication, in my classes we would talk about resumes and how to market ourselves and the soft skills we had to employers. Like, maybe I don't have the technical knowledge or ability of coding using a certain computer program or engineering or being an architect. I don't have those hard skills, so to speak. But I can say that I am an effective communicator and a leader, and I'm good at public speaking. And these soft skills are real skills that not only employers value, but I think are also super important skills to have to just interact with other human beings on a daily basis. But the thing is, we don't always explicitly teach these skills to children. In school, children might take classes in math or science, but they're just expected to pick up things like empathy or teamwork along the way. And in my opinion, those things are way too important to be left up to chance. And that's really the foundation of CosmoKidz, right? To make these implicit lessons explicit and to give children language to talk about what they're experiencing and tools to reflect on their relationships. From developing and researching the effects of CosmoKidz for over a decade, the CMM Institute has been able to see that CosmoKidz helps children in a number of ways, including that it helps children to develop an appreciation for our interpersonal worlds and relationships, develop compassion and empathy, develop the ability to be curious and self-reflexive, and to develop skills to create better social worlds for themselves. And it has to be kids, right? We talk about patterns in CMM, the patterns that we perpetuate that create our social worlds. So if you're an adult now who struggled to be empathetic as a kid and struggled to express your feelings, then chances are you are now an adult who struggles to be empathetic and to express your feelings, right? There is, of course, always the possibility of learning and growing, but it can be really hard to acknowledge and reflect on and actually change patterns that you've been stuck in for so long. The idea behind CosmoKidz is that kids who are taught to value their relationships and their feelings and to communicate those in a healthy way will grow up to be adults who value their relationships and feelings and communicate in a healthier way. I mentioned that children were involved in the co-construction of this program, so the activities revolve around the interpersonal challenges that kids deal with. Bullying, making friends, playing together, learning together. It all goes back to creating better social worlds. So if we want our world to be full of adults that possess the ability to create better social worlds, when those social worlds include politics and money and working and having a family and traveling, then surely that starts with giving children the ability to create better social worlds when their social worlds look like recess and snack time and classrooms and playgrounds. I remember how I felt sitting in my first interpersonal communication class. It was so empowering and eye-opening to learn all these new ideas and ways of understanding things that I was already experiencing, but just didn't know how to talk about. And that was an incredible time, but it also came with some resentment for me. Like, why didn't I know this earlier? I could have saved myself a lot of struggle and confusion and hurt if I had had those skills and language from a younger age. So I think CosmoKidz is just brilliant because children deserve to feel empowered in the way that I did without having to also deal with the resentment. Because of my experience, I will always believe in the power of giving people the language to express themselves and to describe their experiences to be so life-changing. I also think that it is important to follow language with action, but to me it all starts with language. You'll hear in the upcoming conversation episode with CosmoKidz teachers Nicole, Amy, and Katrina that part of what's so powerful about using the principles of CosmoKidz in their classrooms is giving the kids common language to use, like referring to everyone as friend or using the phrase, what if, to practice empathy and to think, what if that happened to me? How would I feel? How would I want to be treated? Because as we ended up talking about things like bullying or feeling left out or feeling upset are happening, whether you talk about it or not in the classroom. So we should want to give children the best chance possible to deal with these things in a more productive way. Now, the exciting news is that the CMM Institute is beginning to develop CosmoTeens to help continue the conversation for young adults. In the spirit of co-constructing, 5 fellows have been selected. They are students ages 16 to 21 that live in Denmark, Norway, and the United States, who will collaborate to create CosmoTeens. We don't know exactly what CosmoTeens will end up being just yet. It simply has the goal of creating something that will help teens that live around the world to navigate their own social worlds. Using the lens and the language of CMM, we can view this as being the next turn for CMM. We talk about how each thing we do or say or create is just one turn in a larger conversation that started from another turn, that leads to another turn, that leads to another and another. The desire is that these turns ultimately lead to the creation of better social worlds. Which means that this podcast is also a turn in the larger conversation of CMM that will hopefully help co-construct better social worlds. All this to say that in the same way I want to make CMM accessible to anyone and everyone through this podcast, CosmoKidz works to make CMM accessible to young people. If you want to learn more about CosmoKidz, check out their website. I'll provide a link for it. Also, if you're someone who interacts with kids, let the work of CosmoKidz inspire you to think about ways to give kids the skills they need to engage with their social world, the language to best express themselves and to understand others, and the tools to reflect too. If you're not someone who interacts with kids, then maybe take yourself back to the basics. Do some reflecting on the education you got or didn't get about these kinds of ideas. How does it still impact you today? What do you wish your social world looked like? What do you need to learn or do to help it get there? We are all always learning. It's not just for the kids. So thank you for leaning in and opening yourself up to learning with me today. Thank you for joining me for another mini-sode. And join me again next week for a really inspiring and thoughtful conversation episode. I'm Abbie, and this has been Stories Lived, Stories Told.